Our next speaker will be Ambassador Thomas Patrick Melady. Ambassador Thomas has had a career in 3 fields: diplomacy, higher education, and public affairs. He served in 4 diplomatic posts: U.S. Ambassador to Burundi, U.S. Ambassador to Uganda, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Delegation to the United Nations, and U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. His experience in higher education includes service as Executive Vice President of St. Joseph University in Philadelphia and as the President of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield. He was also Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Post-Secondary Education during President Reagan's first term. He served on the faculties of St. John's, Fordham, George Washington, and Seton Hall universities. As an active participant in public affairs, Ambassador Melady was President and Chief Executive Officer of the Connecticut, I always have a problem with that, Public and Economic Council. Dr. Melady is now Professor and Senior Diplomat in Residence at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and serves on the boards and committees of several nonprofit organizations. His lecture topic today is Cultural Diplomacy, Sensitivity to the History of African Relationship with the West.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad that I arrived early because I heard several very interesting presentations. And I'm pleased to be here to chat a few moments about cultural diplomacy, especially in view of the history of U.S.-African relationships. So let's begin first with cultural diplomacy. The classical definition of cultural diplomacy is the exchange of ideas, information, values, systems, traditions, beliefs, and other aspects of culture with the intention of fostering mutual understanding. Although we got to face the fact that has only been recognized several decades ago from the standpoint of formal study. As people move from one area to another, or as trade developed going back to the time of the Phoenicians, there was an interest with one group of people to engage in the exchange of ideas, values, and traditions with another group. Soon it was seen that the understanding of other peoples was in the interest of a community, and with the development of the nation state, the importance of cultural diplomacy became more critical. A key aspect in cultural diplomacy is to be aware of the sensitivity to the important aspects of other cultures. For Americans, this is obvious in American relationships with the European countries. Americans, for the most part, are the descendants of European settlers. There was with the kith and kin aspect, and has varied greatly whether the country was from Scandinavia, Italy, or Eastern Europe. The same was very clear in U.S. relationships with Latin America. And within Latin America, there was a variety of subcultures, all who had nuanced differences. One critical factor in facing the Americans was the aspect that for many in South and Central America, the U.S. was the dominant and sometimes unpleasant Yankee. The historical aspect of U.S. relationships, for example, with China and Japan, was influenced by history. The fears and negative rumors about the Chinese, such as having babies every several months, and of their unusual diseases, obviously was a factor in the subsequent cultural exchanges and relationships. As Chinese immigrants began arriving in increased numbers on the west coast of the United States, a predominant image was the Chinese laundry. Here, the overwhelming white population could bring the dirty clothes to the Chinese laundry to clean. Against this image, local state authorities passed laws prohibiting marriage between white Caucasians and Chinese people. This, of course, was already the situation in regard to prohibition in many states of interracial marriage with African Americans. The growing independence of Sub-Sahara, and we have this map here, has been tremendous. When the independent period began in 1960, there were 4 independent states in Sub-Sahara, just 4. There are now over 50 on that map in Africa, Sub-Sahara. Once independent, the people were energized to be active in the international public square. This included tourism, trade, from time to time, mutual defense arrangements. But we in the West must recognize, pardon me, that the goal of promoting the exchange of ideas, information, and values with the peoples of Africa is burdened by the facts of history. It was only 2 centuries ago in the same map that the areas were the sources of slaves for the United States. This has left a footprint in our relationships with the African people. The slavery period of just 2 centuries ago, nothing in regard to history, was followed by the colonial period. Berlin Conference of 1885, 1886, of the major powers in the world, with the United States participating only as an observer, proclaimed the responsibility of those from the superior civilizations, that's a direct quote, to colonize and, quote, take care of the African people. In the United States, the colonial period in Africa was matched by the desire of segregation that prevailed in many states, many parts of the United States. The racial I'm sorry for the cough. The racial superiority aspect evolved in various stages in the colonial states of Africa. In the British settled areas, there was a tradition, I'm talking about 1860 to about 1912. There was a tradition of rigid separation between the African and European peoples. I can remember in my first visit to Kenya, where I stayed with British friends in the late 1950s, they were very hospitable. And the hospitality consisted of a Kenyan young man who helped me with the laundry and other things. He was referred to always as a boy assigned to me. His name was James, and I never was told his last name. Much has changed since then. There are now, as you can see on this map, over 50 independent states, about 55 I think now. In the same African area, when I first went there in 1959, there were just 4 states. They predominate as a group at the United Nations and other international bodies. While this represents a significant change in less than 100 years, it must more precisely be noted that they have a presence in world affairs. At the United Nations, for example, the significant decisions are made in the Security Council. The 5 permanent seats are reserved for the major states. From time to time, African states are elected to the Security Council, but without the special leverage of having the right of veto. Perhaps the greatest relic of our relationships towards Africa is in the soft and indirect racism present in our culture. Again, so much has been done to eradicate any sign of racial prejudice in federal and state institutions. But there are a few examples that still exist. In large number of American folk tales still recount how when children misbehave, they receive a black mark in the record book. In colonial conversations, such expressions as "it was a dark day" still exist. Recently, a newspaper reported some difficulties for a political leader here in the United States and summarized it as a dark cloud over his hopes for political office. The most striking difference is that in a happy family event of a wedding, the father proudly walks down the church aisle to present his daughter to a lucky young man as his future wife, a tradition that is rooted in several hundred years of history is a way for the father to vindicate family pride in his daughter, who has been a good daughter. The young lady is usually dressed in white. Perhaps as a final illustration of residual racial bias that exists, I can recount one that occurred to my wife and me within the past month. We had dinner home, and we had an African couple, who came for dinner. The evening ended about 10. The following day was a work day. I volunteered to escort the couple to the street corner and help them hail a cab. I did this because it is still known, despite even regulations, that in some cases, cab drivers will avoid a dark-skinned couple for a white couple that may be a block away. My point is that for some, the implementation of cultural diplomacy is not done on a playing field when all participants are free of such impediments, as minor as they may seem in comparison to the past. I do not mean to imply that in these relationships we should indicate any special concern or in any way indicate a desire to compensate for the past. But these are the facts that mature and well-balanced people should be aware of and take into consideration when they are involved in any aspect of cultural diplomacy with individuals whose ancestors suffered the sting of racial inequality. Once the sweep of independence in sub-Saharan started in 1970, the world benefited from the significant contributions to cultural diplomacy of several of the great leaders. I want to mention a few. Leopold Senghor was the advocate from Senegal on the West Coast, was the advocate of universal civilization and racial harmony. As he clearly stated in his numerous writings and in his poetry, he merged African concepts of universal civilization with the special contributions inherent in the culture of negritude. This apostle, as I call him, from the shores of West Africa, was matched by the contributions of Julius K. Nyerere of East Africa, specifically Tanzania, who called for understanding by the world of family socialism. This influenced his diplomacy to place an emphasis on the interest of peoples and families rather than on the interests of the sovereign state. In the same period, Therese Kahama of South Africa, in the face of racial prejudice, courageously advocated racial reconciliation. We in the Western world were cut off from a conversation with the peoples of Africa, and the relationship before the sweep of independence did not allow an exchange of ideas, information, values, and beliefs. In our relationships with friends and associates from Africa, we must also realize the implications of the fact that in general, the African sub-Saharan continent is still plagued by the unholy trinity. poverty, illiteracy, and disease. Again, significant strides have been made in these areas, but the overall figures of the high rates of these three tremendous burdens cannot, of course, be overlooked. A most recent tragedy must also be recognized. Africa, sub-Sahara, has been hit by the tornado of AIDS. It must be acknowledged that when representatives of the now over 50 independent African states seen on this map engage in cultural diplomacy, they, in terms of internal strength, could be playing with a weak hand of cards. I cite these factors so that when we engage in cultural diplomacy with associates and friends from the third world, especially Africa, we should be aware of these elements so deeply rooted in our culture, their culture, our culture. They are subconsciously aware of negative aspects of the past. I'm only suggesting that we should be aware of these facts. Those of us that are engaged in cultural diplomacy should respond accordingly. Finally, in my opinion, an apology about the past would be inappropriate in a conversation with a fellow diplomat. Nevertheless, all of us, regardless of background, will benefit when it is known that the playing field, while vastly improved from the past, is still encumbered by relics of past cultural practice. Let us here celebrate the significant improvements and simultaneously push for greater achievements. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for the keynote address, and I'm sure that you've inspired some questions and comments from the participants. So as always, if you could briefly stand when posing your question, and also introduce yourself. Who would like to go first? The benefit of the final keynote address of the day is we do have some flexibility and time also for discussions. So I encourage you to take the opportunity. Don't be shy. Either comments or questions. Okay, we'll start in the back, and then we'll come to the front. Thank you.
I, for some reason, got tired and sleepy, and then I heard a phrase, universal civilization, or la civilisation de l'universel, à la Senghor, and I woke up. And I was thinking that you were going to proceed with that because I kind of like that phrase and the movement initiated by Senghor, Mrs. Césaire, and Léon Contradamas. I am afraid that in the era of globalization or mondialisation, what Senghor called rendezvous du donner du recevoir, which is part of the universal civilization, that rendezvous du donner du recevoir is going to become the universalization of particular, or maybe what somebody called the particularization of the universal. By this I mean that in this era of globalization, Senghor's universal civilization, which was supposed to be a synthesis of everything, runs the risk of universalizing what is something from a particular civilization, i.e. the European or Western civilization is going to be seen as universal for everybody, which is not necessarily what Senghor meant but when he talked about civilisation universelle, and that's my fear. In other words, of universalizing something that is particularly European and be taken as something that should belong to everybody, and that's the fear I have as a way of interpreting Senghor's phrase relative to negritude.
Well, you indicated the name of a great man, Leopold Sédar Senghor. I feel very attached with my wife to her dissertation on him and his poetry. and talked about how his poetry, the rhythm, indicated a reconciliation. Certainly, I remember writing about Senghor in my books, and I was told, oh, I'm an idealist kind of person, sponsored by the French. It's a waste of time. He was speaking in the 1950s, 1960s, when some said, we need a more thorough, we're going to break through. And some would say, well, it hasn't really worked. But I would say, briefly, we need some idealists who sometimes set a high principle here, and we're here. And we eventually work up to it. You can't find any reasonable people who would criticize the ideal of universal civilization and the best of European, the best of African culture, and to merge it. I think to those who say, well, the results aren't too good in terms of pragmatic standard of living, and so forth, that's why I pointed out briefly in this paper the tragedy, in a way, that we still have the unholy trinity in Africa sub-Sahara, right here. High rates of poverty in comparison to the Western world, high rates of literacy, and high rates of disease. And so it's a challenge. In the context of this subject here, of diplomacy, I merely rated it as a time when we should be aware of it. Those here who will be future diplomats, I was a diplomat, worked in Africa. And it struck me when I first went there. I went quickly from the theory of the classroom to what was going on in Africa. I mean, the first job I had was in Ethiopia, and I saw the impact of it. And then I still appreciated the culture and diversity of Ethiopia. So I think Senghor did contribute. I mentioned quickly two others on the East Coast in Tanzania. Julius Nyerere was a school teacher when I met him. He too talked about socialism, Ujamaa, the universal, so forth. It was hard for most Americans to understand him, not most, but some. I remember at the time of the Cold War, 1960, 1970, 1980, and for some, not for me, but for some it sounded like maybe communism or socialism. And so, while recognized more now than he was a great stable voice. I threw a third name out, and that was the Seretse Kahama, lesser known than the other two, who came from an area when he went off to England to study. When he came back, he couldn't come back home. It was Botswana, which is there on the map, because he married a white girl, an English girl that he met while a student in England, and he couldn't return home. He had various ways of fighting it. One was to start a revolution, call on violence, but he engaged in diplomacy, which we're studying here, back in England, got English friends and others to back him, and saw the end of that horrible regulation in Botswana and also in neighboring South Africa through decided pressure and the use of all kinds of techniques, but not violence. Any other questions?
Additional questions or comments? Okay, and a follow-up question from the back, sure.
The map of Africa there, and I just feel like it's me. You mentioned the word boy applied to Africans who served colonial people who were on the continent. Unfortunately, as bad as that word may sound in the ears of some people who are interested in human dignity, today in Africa, many people have inherited some of those terminologies, including the use of the word boy by an African master or boss, a chef, to somebody who is cooking for him or for her. That's unfortunately a bad thing, but not many people think about that. I recently, 3 years ago, I went back for vacation after many years, and I had many relatives, some friends, who had people doing some work for them, and they were referring to these people as boys, which is a colonial word that has some connotations that some of us would not like, because not all those boys are really boys, but some of them are grown-up people. And I just wanted to throw it this because there are some fellow Africans here. So that's something that we have to possibly think about, the use of language that we have inherited from colonizers.
I'd like to make one comment too. Here in America, you got a big problem if you call a black man a boy. And we have a little poem, and it goes like this. I don't know if you've ever seen a Tarzan movie. Anybody seen Tarzan movie? And they got the guy Boy. You know, he's the little white boy. He's the adopted son of Jane and Tarzan. And Cheetah is the little monkey, right? So Boy played with Tarzan, and Cheetah quit. If you don't know my name, don't call me shit. Just a little levity here.
Well, let me just comment briefly. I cited that only as an illustration. Change in my own lifetime have changed. I can remember my experience, and it took several days. The word was boy, and I was always interested in names. What is it happened to me in this case, James? What is the family name? Oh, we don't bother with family names. Once you get the first name, he's a very good boy. He's been very faithful to us, and he's quite right. He was a young man. I guess probably in his 20s, I would say now. But that's totally faded away. And we have seen in the evolution and an improvement in the relationship. I would say I think the improvement was not for primarily moral reasons, was because they got power. Once you gave power and presence to the African people, they gained some respect. And you won't hear, you go to Kenya now, and I've been there for a few years, but or in those countries, you won't hear that term anymore. And we'd be grateful for that. And we can come here and discuss cultural diplomacy when these people have the dignity of their own state and their own flag, something they didn't have 50 years ago.
Okay, any additional final questions or comments? Okay, if not, then let's use this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to Ambassador Melady for an excellent lecture and discussion that follows. Thank you very, very much. A pleasure to have you back for the second time here at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy.